I was a sergeant in the U.S. Army and ETSing, getting out from the military, when President Bush ordered more troops into Iraq in 2003. I had just returned home to Austin, Texas, when I was summoned into my local National Guard unit at Camp Mabry and told that I was being recalled to the Army. But the unit was already tasked out to deploy to Iraq. I was not part of their unit yet, so the commander offered to give me a waiver to deploy with a government contractor, Halliburton, in Houston. I knew that I would make more money as a contractor, so I took the offer. Not long after arriving in Kuwait at Camp Doha, I began working with the operations team overseeing logistics affairs. We would oversee the daily convoy of supply between Kuwait and Baghdad, a route riddled with IED incidents, small arms skirmishes, and almost constant breakdowns of Army and civilian vehicles. Because I was a SAW gunner in the 1st Infantry Division while in active duty, and was technically still in the Guard, I was often in the convoys manning a mounted weapon that accompanied the mostly civilian convoys. During these runs, we had a few strange encounters in an area south of Baghdad known then as Camp Babylon. Occupied by French troops, but then designated an archaeological site for obvious reasons, Camp Babylon was set up in the area that was said to originally be inhabited by the famous Tower of Babel. Indeed, there were ruins there that did look like a massive structure once stood at that spot. I had 2 strange incidents happen to me while passing through there. The first incident seems a bit benign, but sets the mood for the second. We were passing through Camp Babylon in the afternoon one day when our convoy took small arms fire. The SOP at the time, standard operating procedure, was to stop the convoy and return fire. This was because in the past, such incidents ended up being a lone gunman attempting to scare the convoy into running into IEDs on the road. Because of this, the SOP changed to stop the convoy, dismount, and return fire. While engineers looked for explosive devices on the road, we scanned the horizon for enemy. Nothing. They most likely fled immediately. However, the ruins around Camp Babylon were alive with shadow figures that seemed to move about the area. Several times we would spot the figures, but they would immediately disappear. A contractor lying beside me with his weapon commented, "How odd that we are in the shadow of Babel and fighting the supernatural." I didn't respond, but knew he was a 32nd degree Mason who was really into the arcane aspects of Babylon, etc. I didn't feel at the time that much was supernatural, but certainly did see the shadowy and bizarrely small figures dart about the structures. Once the road was deemed clear, we continued on to Baghdad. The second incident occurred about a month later. At this point, the weather in southern Iraq and Kuwait had turned quite cold at night. During this encounter, we had just completed the supply run to Baghdad and were returning back to Camp Doha in Kuwait when a vehicle in our convoy broke down. Once again, we found ourselves right at Camp Babylon. While the Army mechanics took a look at the vehicle and the rest of us took up fighting positions around the area, strange things began to occur. It started with a strange light bobbing in the desert. Thinking it was a person with a flashlight, we used NVGs, night vision goggles, to watch. It was simply a glowing ball of light moving towards a set of ruins. After initial contact with the light, a few of us had moved forward away from the convoy to see what the source was. After seeing it was self-contained and not a person, we were a bit alarmed. Then we heard a sound that I will never forget. A long wailing began from one of the ruined structures/foundations not far away. It sounded like a woman in agony, mixed with loneliness. On and on the sounds went while we huddled in the cold and dark, wondering what the hell we were listening to. With our NVGs equipped, we used our flashlights to spotlight the ruins. If you've ever done this, you will know that a normal flashlight with NVGs looks like a massive beam of light. We scoured the area, but no source of the wails or the ball of light were seen. About this time, we were told via radio that the vehicle was repaired and ready to roll, so we decided to return to the convoy. I was slinging my saw over my shoulder when I noticed my contractor partner was staring at the ruins in horror. He was frozen. I shook him, and he snapped out of his stupor, quickly leaving the area with the rest of us. Once we were back at the camp and it was pleasantly daylight the following morning, several of us were chatting about the encounter at Camp Babylon before our daily operations briefing. It was then that I remembered the terrified expression on the face of the contractor. so I asked him about it. He was still obviously traumatized by the event, but managed to explain that, as we were leaving our position on the sandy hill, he saw a tall black figure standing beside the ruins. It was watching us as we were looking for him/her/it. He said that he felt an instant wave of despair hit him and thought that he was going to die. He didn't remember leaving the area. His next memory was in the Humvee headed back to Kuwait. I now write non-fiction books about haunted places for Llewellyn Publishing and have visited hundreds of reputedly haunted spots, but I'll never forget the wailing figure at the ruins of Babel. It's also worth noting that when I related this story to some of our Pakistani employees at Camp Doha and Camp Arifjan, they also were quite horrified. One of them, a translator we called Artie, said that we had encountered a jinn, or a damn spirit, and that we were lucky to be able to tell the tale. I agree. My grandfather died in 1995 due to emphysema and other health concerns. He was in his early 60s and left us prematurely as he had many people who loved and depended on him, including many young grandchildren. I was only 4 years old, almost 5 at the time when he passed, and I don't remember much from this darker time in life, but I remember his funeral extremely vividly. I was in a funeral home that has multiple parlors and many hallways throughout the building. I remember being outside of his parlor and seeing him across the room. We locked eyes. I walked over to him. After all, he was my grandpa, and I did not realize at the time that he had passed on. We began our usual, as we were two peas in a pod and had a special relationship, and we held hands and walked through the halls. Much of the conversation I do not recall, but I do remember showing him the lounge area, as that was my favorite place to be, what with all the snacks and vending machines. As we approached the area that we had met at, we stopped, and he said to me, "Michael, I have to go now." He had vanished, literally leaving my hand empty in the air. I can still see my empty hand and remember the shock/confusion. The part that helps me to think this was an authentic experience, and this is something my grandmother, aunt, and mother remember well and were concerned for years about. As I approach the open casket, my mother picks me up. I see my Grandpa Leroy there in his piece, and I begin, confused, to relentlessly ask why Grandpa was in casket and what is wrong with him. My mother told me, crying, and I remember this clearly, "Michael, honey, he is dead. He is gone and not coming back." I was in disbelief, arguing, No, I just saw him. He's outside." After this, I remember us all crying together, but that is all. I never spoke about it until I was about 12 or 13 years old. I was at my grandmother's, and her health was wavering at the time. I'd been thinking about it a lot with her being in that state and having memories of my experience, and I finally broke down and told them what I had remembered. Again we cried, and they didn't believe I could remember that, or that I had held on to it through all those years of childhood. They, in a way, directly corroborate my experience for me, at least solidifying it in my head as a final goodbye from one of my favorite human beings, as they remember the scene at the casket. They were always too afraid to ask me about it, maybe to protect me from emotional anguish. My grandmother, for the remaining year or so she was with us, would ask me to tell her the story any time I would visit her. She also claims to have woken up one day feeling my grandfather laying next to her. She said she could feel it was him, as if she went to bed next to him and woke up together. She never told anyone that until I had shared my story. I hope anyone reading this enjoyed the story. It's one I will never forget. In 2020, at the beginning of COVID, I had just given birth. At this time, I could only have one other person in the room with me my entire stay at the hospital. Of course, my kid's father was there, but like the third day, he left to clean up our house and get everything prepared for me and baby. I had gotten sick and had a C-section, so I had to stay for about 4-5 days. Well, while he was away, a nurse named Kelly said she would be helping me throughout the day and spending time with me so I don't feel lonely while Dad is gone. I couldn't really hold my baby due to me being sick and the pain from the C-section, so my nurses would come in every time it was time to feed. I noticed when they came in, they wouldn't acknowledge Kelly, and she would go to the farthest part of the room and she would tell me, "I'm just going to get out of the way." Now, she did tell me that she didn't specialize in what they did. She was just for comfort. So I didn't question anything. The entire day she was so helpful and encouraging to me. I really believe I would have broken down if she wasn't in there with me. She was such a sweetheart. Well, after about 5 or 6 hours, she told me she had to leave and that she would come visit me before her shift was over to see how I was doing. She hugged me and blew a kiss at my baby and walked out of the room. Later that night, Dad came back and he was very upset. He had told me some stuff happened with his mom and that he was sorry he took so long. I was upset, but I told him a nurse named Kelly kept me company. As I'm telling him about her, my nurse is changing my sheets and she's like, "Who is Kelly?" I explained and she said that nobody named Kelly was in my room or working that day. So I instantly thought about those women who would pretend to be nurses and kidnap children. But my nurse told me that I may be hallucinating and she told my doctor. I talked to my doctor and he said the same thing. Well, a couple of hours later, a nurse that I didn't recognize came in my room and said, "I know this might sound crazy, but everyone on the floor is talking about you seen Kelly." I said, "Yeah, she was here with me for like 7 hours today. She helped out a lot." We're smiling and laughing while I was telling her about Kelly and how sweet and funny she was. Then she pulled up her phone and showed me pictures of her and Kelly that looked like to be maybe early 2000s. I was smiling, knowing that I wasn't hallucinating. Then she sat down and told me Kelly died over 10 years ago from domestic violence with her boyfriend. I wasn't too shocked because my entire life I've been dealing with paranormal, but I got chills because I never had an encounter this deep. Well, the lady gave me a hug and started crying, saying, "Now I know that she is okay." Since that day, I've been wondering, why did Kelly come in my room and help me? I kind of wish I could see her again.